the room that turned against HIM. Hollywood had rooms that remembered things. Ballrooms where applause once thundered and later echoed in silence, corridors where promises were whispered and careers quietly buried, banquet halls where champagne flowed beside jealousy so sharp it could cut glass. The grand ballroom of the Beverly Hilton was one of those rooms. It didn't forget. It absorbed moments and held them, waiting for the right night to release them again. That night the room was full. 270 people filled the space, directors in tailored suits, producers wearing practiced smiles, actors whose faces were familiar to millions and unknown to themselves. It was an industry event, polished and polite on the surface, electric underneath. Careers were being measured not by trophies, but by who noticed whom, who nodded, who looked away. At the center of the room, without seeking it, sat Dean Martin. Dean didn't like these nights, he never had. He preferred places where laughter came naturally, where music filled the gaps between words, where people showed you who they were without needing an invitation card or a seating chart. But he had agreed to come, out of courtesy, out of respect for the craft, and because sometimes saying no too often created its own kind of noise. He was scheduled to present an award. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just a walk onto the stage, a few light words, a name read aloud, applause, exit. Clean, professional, forgettable. That was the plan. Across the room, at a table closer to the stage, sat Clint Eastwood. Clint was younger, sharper in posture, quieter in presence, but heavier with intention. He watched more than he spoke, listened more than he smiled. He carried himself like a man who believed deeply in seriousness, serious work, serious preparation, serious ambition. And tonight, something in him was restless. Success had arrived quickly for Clint, but confidence hadn't caught up yet. Instead, it lingered somewhere behind his ribs, tangled with doubt, pressure, and the terrifying awareness that the next step, directing, would strip away every excuse he'd ever had. When Dean Martin walked onto the stage, the room softened. Not because Dean demanded attention, but because he didn't. He didn't stride, he didn't announce himself. He simply appeared relaxed and unbothered, as though the spotlight had wandered onto him by accident. His voice, warm and effortless, carried through the ballroom as he made a few self-deprecating remarks. Nothing cruel, nothing pointed, just enough to make people feel at ease. People laughed. Some laughed warmly, some politely, some with the faint irritation of people who believed ease should be earned through visible struggle. Dean presented the award, shook the winner's hand, stepped back from the microphone, and began walking toward the side of the room. That should have been the end of it. But as he passed near one of the front tables, something caught his ear. His name. At first he thought it was coincidence. Then he heard it again, this time sharper, clearer, threaded with disdain rather than recognition. He slowed, just enough to listen without being obvious. Years in entertainment had taught him how to disappear in plain sight. The voice belonged to Clint. "He's everything that's wrong with this business," Clint was saying, unaware or uncaring that his words were traveling farther than he thought. "Guys like him don't prepare, they don't dig, they show up, play themselves, collect a check, and leave. That's not craft, that's coasting." A pause, a nervous shift from someone at the table. Dean didn't move. "He's charming," Clint continued, "but charm isn't depth, it's a shortcut. 60 films and the same act every time. People call that a career, I call it a scam." Around the table, conversation slowed. Nearby guests leaned slightly closer, pretending not to listen while doing exactly that. The room, moments ago buzzing with polite chatter, began to tilt, attention quietly redirecting itself toward something unscheduled. Dean stood still. Not frozen, not shocked. Just still. He felt the words land, not like a punch, but like cold water. They didn't hurt the way insults from strangers hurt. They carried the heavier weight of judgment from someone inside the same world, someone who believed himself righteous enough to declare another man's worth obsolete. For a moment, Dean considered walking away. He could pretend he hadn't heard it. He could let the night continue, let Clint enjoy the echo of his own certainty, let the room digest the moment without him. That had always been Dean's instinct. Avoid confrontation, dissolve tension with humor, move on. But something in him shifted. Not anger. Something quieter, firmer. A realization that silence in this room would sound like agreement. Dean turned. He didn't rush, he didn't square his shoulders. He simply walked to the table, pulled out a chair without asking, and sat down. Clint looked up mid-sentence. Their eyes met. The air changed instantly. "Evening," Dean said calmly. The table went silent. Clint's expression flickered, surprise first, then calculation. "Dean, I didn't realize." "You called me a hack," Dean said evenly. "I just wanted to be sure I heard you correctly." The words were quiet, but they carried. Nearby tables stopped pretending. Someone set a glass down a little too loudly. Across the ballroom, heads turned. Clint straightened. "I was speaking generally." "In a room with 270 people," Dean replied. "About me." "A beat." "This isn't the place," Clint said. Dean smiled faintly, not amused, not hostile, just certain. "This is exactly the place." He leaned back in the chair, folding his hands loosely. Posture relaxed in a way that only unsettled people who relied on tension to feel powerful. "You said I don't prepare," Dean continued. "That I have no depth, that I coast on charm. Before we go any further, I want to know something." Clint held his gaze. "Do you actually believe that?" Dean asked. "Or did you just need someone to be smaller than you tonight?" The room didn't breathe. No one applauded, no one interrupted, no one saved Clint. And for the first time that evening, Clint realized he wasn't speaking to a caricature, a lazy legend, or an easy target. He was speaking to a man who had spent decades mastering the art of restraint. And restraint in moments like this was power. The silence that became a weapon. The silence did not fall all at once. It crept in inch by inch like fog rolling across a stage after the lights dim. Chairs stopped shifting. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the soft clink of silverware surrendered. 270 people, some of the most powerful voices in Hollywood, were suddenly reduced to witnesses. Dean Martin sat there as if he belonged at that table, as if the invitation had always been his. His posture was relaxed but not careless. It was the posture of a man who knew exactly when he no longer needed to perform. The faint smile on his face wasn't amusement, it was control. Across from him, Clint Eastwood felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. This wasn't a confrontation he had rehearsed. Clint had spent years preparing for moments, studying scripts until dawn, analyzing performances frame by frame, memorizing theory, structure, motivation. He believed preparation was armor, but this moment had slipped past all of that. It had arrived raw, unplanned, and fully exposed. Dean leaned forward just slightly. "You know," Dean said calmly, his voice low but steady, "people always think confidence is loud. They think it announces itself, but real confidence doesn't need an audience." A ripple passed through the nearest tables. No one dared speak. Clint straightened in his chair. "If you're looking for an apology—" "I'm not," Dean interrupted gently. "I'm looking for honesty." That landed harder than anger ever could. Dean continued, "You said I don't prepare, that I don't respect the craft, so tell me, what does preparation look like to you, Clint?" Clint hesitated, not long, just long enough for the room to notice. "It means studying," Clint said. "Understanding motivation, knowing why a character moves, speaks, reacts, it's discipline." Dean nodded slowly, as if considering a student's answer. "That's a good definition." Somewhere in the room, a director shifted uncomfortably. "And when did you start doing that?" Dean asked. "Years ago." "And before that?" Clint frowned. "Before that?" "Yes," Dean said softly. "Before the books, before the theories, before the rules you decided mattered more than instincts." The question wasn't accusatory. That made it worse. Clint opened his mouth, then closed it. Dean leaned back again, folding his hands. "I started performing when I was a kid, rooms where people didn't care about your process, rooms where if you lost them for 10 seconds they turned on you. You learned fast, or you didn't survive." A few older faces in the crowd nodded, recognizing the truth of it. "You learn to read people," Dean went on. "Not characters, people. You learn timing, restraint when silence says more than words. That's preparation too. It just doesn't look impressive in an interview." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They settled into the room like weight. Clint felt heat rise in his face. That still doesn't explain the lack of range. Dean smiled again, this time with the faintest hint of sadness. "Range is an interesting word. People use it when they mean visible struggle." He tilted his head. Have you ever noticed how audiences praise performances where they can see the actor working, the effort, the pain, the method? They call it brave. Dean paused, letting the room breathe again. But when the work disappears, when it looks effortless, they call it shallow, because they can't see the labor, they mistake ease for emptiness. Someone near the back exhaled sharply. Clint felt something shift inside him, not defeat, resistance. You play versions of yourself. Dean nodded without offense. Of course I do, everyone does. He leaned forward now, eyes steady. The difference is I don't apologize for it. The room leaned with him. You bring your stillness to your roles, Dean continued. Your intensity, your silence, does that make you lazy or does it make you consistent? Clint's jaw tightened. Dean didn't press immediately. He let the question sit, unanswered, uncomfortable. Then he said quietly, You didn't call me a hack because of my work. A murmur rippled. You called me a hack because I make this look easy, Dean said, and you're afraid it is. The words struck like a bell. For the first time that night, Clint's confidence cracked, not shattered, just enough to show the fear beneath it. The fear of directing, of stepping into a role where charm wouldn't save him, where theory might fail him, where success wasn't guaranteed. Dean saw it, and instead of exploiting it, he softened. Fear makes people cruel, Dean said gently. It makes them judge, makes them reach for labels instead of understanding. He straightened, voice firmer now. But here's the thing, you don't get to call someone a fraud just because their path scares you. The room felt smaller, tighter. Dean stood. No theatrics, no raised voice. Just a man rising at the exact moment everyone realized he'd already won. You want to direct? Dean said. Good, you should. You'll learn things no book can teach you. You'll fail in ways you don't expect. And when that happens, you'll hope the people watching you choose restraint over ridicule. He looked down at Clint, not towering, not threatening, just honest. That's what professionalism looks like. A long, breathless pause followed. Finally, Clint spoke. His voice was quieter than before. I shouldn't have said it. Dean waited. I judged you without understanding you, Clint added, and I was wrong. The apology wasn't polished, it wasn't graceful, but it was real. Dean nodded once. That's all I needed to hear. He turned away, walking back toward his table as the room slowly exhaled. Conversations didn't resume immediately. People needed time to absorb what they'd witnessed, to recalibrate their understanding of power. Because what they had just seen wasn't dominance. It was mastery. And as Dean Martin sat back down, the legend in the room subtly shifted. Not louder, not bigger. Stronger. When power showed its real face. The applause did not come right away. That was the strange part. In Hollywood, applause was reflexive. It filled gaps, smoothed over discomfort, rescued people from moments that cut too close to the bone. But this time, the room hesitated. 270 people sat suspended between instinct and understanding, unsure whether clapping would cheapen what had just happened. Dean Martin had already returned to his seat. He didn't look back. He didn't check the room. He didn't wait for validation. That, more than anything else, unsettled the crowd. At table 12, Clint Eastwood remained seated, staring at a spot on the tablecloth as though it might offer him an escape route. His hands, usually steady, were clenched just enough to reveal tension. He was not humiliated, but he was exposed. And exposure, Clint was learning, was far more dangerous than embarrassment. Around him, people avoided eye contact, not out of cruelty but uncertainty. No one wanted to be the next person forced to confront themselves so publicly. Conversations began again in fragments, half-sentences, cautious laughter, but the tone had shifted. Something had cracked open, and everyone could feel it. At Dean's table, an older director leaned in and murmured, "You didn't raise your voice." Dean smiled faintly. Didn't need to. The director studied him. Most men would have crushed him. Dean took a slow sip of his drink. Crushing someone doesn't prove strength, it just proves you had the chance. That answer stayed with the man long after the night ended. Across the room, Clint felt the weight of that restraint pressing on him harder than any insult could have. Dean hadn't attacked his talent. He hadn't mocked his ambition. He had done something far more disorienting. He had named Clint's fear out loud and then refused to punish him for it. That kindness felt undeserved, and because it was undeserved, it burned. Clint's mentor leaned close and whispered, "You should say something else." Clint shook his head. "I already said enough." "No," the man replied quietly, "you haven't." Clint swallowed. His instincts screamed at him to stay silent, to let the night move on, to protect what little dignity he had left. But another instinct, new, unfamiliar, and deeply uncomfortable, pushed back. He stood. Chairs creaked, heads turned again. The room froze for the second time that night. Dean didn't look up immediately. He sensed it before he saw it, the subtle shift of attention, the collective intake of breath. Clint cleared his throat. His voice carried, though it wasn't loud. "I need to say something." The pause that followed was electric. "I came here tonight thinking seriousness made me superior," Clint said. "Thinking that because I struggled loudly, I deserved more respect than someone who didn't." Dean finally turned. Clint met his eyes. "I was wrong." This wasn't an apology anymore. This was a confession. "I confused effort with virtue," Clint continued. "I confused theory with wisdom, and I used your success as a mirror for my own insecurity." A murmur rippled through the room. Surprise, admiration, disbelief. Dean didn't interrupt. "I don't know yet what kind of director I'll be," Clint said. "But I know what kind of man I don't want to be, and tonight showed me that." The silence afterward was different from before, softer, cleaner, as if the room itself had exhaled something toxic. Dean stood once more. This time there was no tension, only attention. "You didn't have to do that," Dean said quietly. "I did," Clint replied. "If I want to be taken seriously, I need to start being honest." Dean nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Honesty is expensive," he said, "but it pays better in the long run." A few people smiled. A few others looked away, unsettled by how close the words hit home. Dean extended his hand. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, just a simple gesture. Clint hesitated for half a second, then took it. The handshake was firm, brief, and final. No photographers captured it. No headlines framed it yet, but everyone in that room understood what it meant. This wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. The ceremony resumed, but it felt almost irrelevant now. Awards were handed out, speeches were made, smiles returned, yet beneath it all, something fundamental had shifted. People weren't talking about trophies anymore. They were talking about what they'd seen, about how power could look quiet, how authority didn't need cruelty, how dignity could disarm arrogance without destroying it. Later that night, as guests filtered into the parking lot under the soft California air, Clint caught up to Dean. "Dean," he said. Dean turned patient. "I don't expect forgiveness," Clint added, "but I want you to know I heard you, really heard you." Dean studied him for a moment, then smiled, not indulgent, not cold. "That's all anyone can ask," Dean said. "Just don't forget it when you're the one holding the room." Clint nodded. He wouldn't. Years later, people would talk about this night in different ways. Some would exaggerate it. Some would minimize it. But those who were there would always remember the same thing, not the insult, not the tension, not even the apology. They would remember the moment they learned that real power didn't shout. It waited. And when it spoke, it didn't kneel others through force. It taught them how to stand. The aftermath that no one saw. The night ended the way all Hollywood nights did. Valets shouting names, engines humming, laughter spilling into the warm air as though nothing unusual had happened. But something had happened. And the people who felt it most weren't the ones who talked about it the loudest. Dean Martin left early. He always did after events like this. Once the room's energy shifted, once the invisible calculations began, who gained, who lost, who should be avoided, Dean knew better than to linger. He didn't want congratulations. He didn't want explanations. He didn't want the night turned into a story before it had finished teaching its lesson. As he slid into the back seat of his car, the city lights reflecting faintly off the glass, his driver glanced at him in the mirror. "Long night," the driver said. Dean smiled softly. "Important one." At another curb, several yards away, Clint Eastwood stood alone for a moment before getting into his own car. People had patted him on the shoulder. Some had praised his honesty. Others had offered careful reassurance. But Clint hadn't missed what wasn't said, no flattery, no ego-soothing, no rushed absolution. The room had granted him something rarer than forgiveness. Time. And time, Clint realized, was what he would have to earn. That night, sleep didn't come easily to him. Every sentence replayed, every look, every pause where Dean had chosen calm instead of cruelty. Clint had prepared for criticism his entire career, but he had never prepared to be understood. And that understanding changed him. In the weeks that followed, the industry buzzed. Trade columns hinted at a tense exchange. Whispers traveled faster than facts, growing sharper or softer depending on who told them. Some framed the moment as a clash of generations, others as an ego check. A few tried to turn it into a rivalry. But something unusual happened. Dean Martin didn't comment. Not once. No interviews, no witty remarks, no attempts to define the narrative. He went back to work, to music, to quiet dinners, to a life that didn't require public vindication. The absence of his voice became its own statement. People noticed. Clint noticed most of all. When Clint stepped onto the set of his first film as a director, something inside him had shifted. He still prepared meticulously. But now, when an actor approached a scene differently than he expected, he didn't correct them immediately. He watched. He listened. Sometimes he learned. Sometimes the performance worked because it didn't look like work. Months later, Clint sent a handwritten note to Dean. It was short, awkward, honest. "You were right about restraint. I'm starting to understand what you meant. Thank you for not turning that night into something I couldn't recover from." Dean read it, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. He never replied. Not because he didn't care, but because some lessons were meant to echo without response. Years passed. Careers evolved. Clint Eastwood became not just a director, but a respected one, known for his quiet sets, his trust in actors, his refusal to overdirect moments that needed space to breathe. People who worked with him often said the same thing: he lets the work speak. Dean Martin continued to do what he had always done, make it look easy. And then, one afternoon long after the incident had faded from public memory, Clint was asked in an interview about early mistakes. The question caught him off guard. He paused. "There was a night," Clint said slowly, "when I mistook seriousness for superiority." The interviewer leaned in. "I judged a man who had already mastered what I was still chasing," Clint continued. "He didn't embarrass me, he didn't crush me, he showed me what professionalism actually looks like." The interviewer asked for a name. Clint gave it. Dean Martin. When Dean passed away years later, among the many tributes and carefully crafted statements, one message stood out. It wasn't long. It wasn't poetic. It was simple. Dean Martin taught me humility without humiliation. That lesson shaped everything that came after. At the funeral, someone quietly mentioned the old story. The night of the insult, the confrontation, the apology. A friend of Dean's shook his head. "That wasn't the important part," he said. "The important part was what Dean didn't do." Because Dean Martin could have destroyed Clint Eastwood that night. He had the room. He had the reputation. He had the momentum. Instead, he chose something rarer. He chose restraint. He chose dignity. He chose to turn conflict into instruction, and ego into understanding. And that choice outlived applause, headlines, and even careers. That is why the story still matters. Not because someone was put on their knees, but because someone was shown how to stand back up. The moment history never recorded. History records applause. It records awards, box office numbers, headlines written the morning after. What history almost never records is what happens after the lights go out. The quiet decisions made when no one is watching. The character revealed not on a stage, but in the long, uncomfortable silence that follows it. That silence followed Dean Martin for weeks. Not because he regretted what he said, but because he understood what it had cost. Dean had disrupted something sacred in Hollywood that night, the unspoken rule that reputation should never be challenged in public, even when the challenge was deserved, even when silence would slowly rot the truth from the inside. Some doors closed quietly after that evening, not slammed, never slammed, just invitations that didn't arrive, meetings that were rescheduled. smiles that carried a fraction less warmth. Dean noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't flinch. Because for Dean, dignity was never about applause. It was about being able to look at yourself in the mirror when the room was empty. Across town, Clint Eastwood was fighting a different battle. The apology had freed him publicly, but privately it had trapped him in something far more dangerous: self-awareness. Every time he stepped onto a set, every time someone deferred to his opinion, Clint felt the weight of the question Dean had never asked aloud but had carved into him anyway. Are you leading or proving? One afternoon, weeks into pre-production, an actor challenged Clint's direction. Nothing dramatic, just a different interpretation. Old Clint would have shut it down immediately, citing preparation, theory, control. Instead, Clint heard Dean's voice in his head. Not mocking, not superior, just calm. Watch first. So Clint watched, and the scene worked better than his version ever would have. That night, Clint sat alone in his office long after everyone had gone home. The script lay open on the desk, but he wasn't reading it. He was thinking about the man who had made restraint feel like authority. Not once since the ballroom incident had Dean called Clint to check in. Not once had he followed up, corrected him, or reminded him of the debt. That absence was deliberate. Dean understood something Clint was just beginning to learn. Real lessons lose their power when you hover over them. Months passed. The film wrapped. Reviews came in measured, respectful, promising, nothing explosive, nothing humiliating, exactly the kind of beginning Clint needed. And then one night, at a quiet charity dinner far from cameras and headlines, Clint saw Dean again. Different room, fewer people, no stage. Dean was seated alone, sipping a drink, listening more than speaking. Clint hesitated. This wasn't a room where an approach would be noticed or forgiven. Still, he walked over. Dean, Clint said. Dean looked up, surprised but not guarded. Evening. They stood there for a moment, two men stripped of narrative and audience. No applause waiting, no witnesses who mattered. I wanted to tell you something, Clint said. Not as a director, not as an actor, just as a man. Dean gestured to the chair across from him. Then sit. Clint did. I've been thinking about that night, Clint said. About what you said and what you didn't. Dean listened. You could have ended me, Clint continued. You had the room, you had the authority. Instead, you gave me something harder. What's that? Dean asked. A mirror, Clint said, and you didn't stand in front of it with me. Dean smiled faintly. Mirrors work best when you're alone with them. Clint swallowed. Why? Why what? Why not finish me off? Clint asked. Why not make sure everyone knew you won? Dean leaned back, eyes thoughtful. Because winning ends conversations, teaching continues them. Clint nodded slowly. That night they didn't become friends. There were no promises of collaboration, no grand reconciliation. But something deeper settled between them. Respect. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up years later in choices no one connects back to that moment. Years later, when Clint had power, real power, he used it differently. He protected younger actors instead of testing them. He listened before correcting. He defended colleagues when gossip tried to reduce them. And every time he did, he remembered the man who had shown him how strength could look like restraint. As for Dean, he never told the story. Not because it wasn't important, but because he believed stories should earn their own longevity, and this one did. It lived on quietly, passed from set to set, whispered as an example not of humiliation but of grace. People would say, that's how Dean Martin handled things. And they'd mean something far bigger than charm. Because Dean Martin didn't put Clint Eastwood on his knees with cruelty. He put him on his knees with truth. And then stepped aside so he could stand back up stronger. The legacy that outlived the room. Time has a way of stripping moments down to their truth. Years passed, headlines changed. Careers rose, stumbled, rose again. Hollywood reinvented itself the way it always did, new faces, new rules, new urgencies. And yet long after the ballroom lights had dimmed and the chairs had been stacked away, that night refused to disappear. Not because it was loud, but because it was clean. Dean Martin grew quieter in the public eye as the years went on, not smaller, not diminished, just less interested in explaining himself. He didn't chase relevance. He let relevance come looking for him. When people asked him about professionalism, about longevity, about how he stayed steady in an industry addicted to chaos, he answered with half smiles and gentle deflections. "You do the work," he'd say, "then you go home." Those who worked closely with him understood what he really meant. You don't borrow your worth from rooms that change their minds every season. Clint Eastwood, meanwhile, became something few expected at the time, an anchor, a director actors trusted, a leader crews respected, someone who didn't need to prove his intelligence by diminishing anyone else's. On his sets, people noticed a strange calm. Decisions were firm but never cruel. Corrections were precise but never humiliating. When asked how he learned to lead that way, Clint would pause. And then, if he felt the room deserved honesty, he would tell a version of the story. He never exaggerated it, never made himself the hero, never painted Dean as a conqueror. He spoke about fear, about arrogance disguised as seriousness, about how easy it is to mistake pressure for insight. "He didn't embarrass me," Clint would say. "He stopped me, and that saved me." That sentence mattered, because Hollywood was full of people who could embarrass you, full of people who could end you, very few who could stop you without destroying you. Dean passed away quietly, the way he had lived when the curtain wasn't up. Tributes poured in, carefully worded, lovingly edited, filled with praise for the legend, the voice, the charisma. But the stories people told privately were different. They talked about how Dean treated waiters, about how he never raised his voice, about how he listened longer than necessary, about how when conflict came, and it always did, he met it without poison. At a small gathering after the funeral, someone mentioned the old incident, the insult, the confrontation, the apology. A longtime friend of Dean's shook his head gently. "People always remember the insult," he said. "They should remember the restraint. Because that was the real legacy. Not the words that wounded, but the discipline that refused to wound back." Years later, a young director once asked Clint Eastwood for advice. The industry was changing again, and fear had returned under a different name. "What's the biggest mistake you can make when you finally have power?" the young man asked. Clint didn't answer immediately. "Thinking you have to use it," he said finally. He explained that power wasn't proven by domination, but by choice, by knowing when you could crush someone and choosing not to. By understanding that the room will always remember how you won long after it forgets that you did. That lesson traced back to one night, one chair pulled out without permission, one calm voice refusing to rise, one man secure enough to stand still while another confronted his own reflection. Dean Martin never tried to put Clint Eastwood on his knees. That's what made it happen. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten, didn't need to perform. He simply held the line, between dignity and ego, between criticism and cruelty, between power and character. And in doing so, he taught everyone watching something Hollywood rarely teaches. That real strength doesn't humiliate. It clarifies. That real authority doesn't demand submission. It earns respect. And that the moments that change us most are often the ones that leave no scars, only standards. That night wasn't remembered because someone was torn down. It was remembered because someone was built back up, by a man who understood that the highest form of victory is leaving the other person better than you found them. That is why the story lasted. That is why it still matters. And that is why, long after applause fades, the quiet power of character endures. And